The vinyl of the booth was cold against her back, a stark contrast to the thick, warm air of the diner. It smelled of burnt coffee and fried onions, the soundtrack a hiss of bacon on the griddle, and the low murmur of conversations she was not a part of. She traced the rim of her chipped ceramic mug, the motion a small, lonely anchor in a room full of pairs and groups celebrating the end of another year. That was when she saw him. He stood just inside the door, the biting winter wind swirling around him before the glass swung shut. He was a pillar of stillness in the chaos, his dark wool coat falling in a severe line to his knees, his hands buried in his pockets. He was alone. The hostess, flustered and overwhelmed, shook her head apologetically.
Notables.
Not for one. Not for anyone. The man's jaw was tight, but he simply nodded, his gaze sweeping the room with an unnerving lack of urgency, as if he were cataloging every exit, every face. His eyes, dark and unreadable, passed over her and continued their sweep. She should have looked away. She should have sunk back into her own solitude and let him leave. But something in his profound stillness, in the way the entire boisterous diner seemed to shrink away from the space he occupied, resonated with the hollow ache in her own chest. So she did something stupid. She raised her hand. A small, hesitant wave. His eyes snapped back to her, and for a heartbeat, the entire world seemed to fall silent. He did not look surprised. He looked like a predator that had just noticed the trap before stepping in it. Then he moved. Not toward the door, but toward her. Each step was deliberate, a slow, measured advance that made the hair on her arms stand up. He stopped at her table, his shadow falling over her. He was taller than she had realized, broader. The scent of cedar and cold night air clung to him. "Is this seat taken?" His voice was a low rumble, gravel and smoke, a sound that did not belong in the cheerful clatter of the diner. Ava swallowed, her throat suddenly dry.
No.
"It's free." He slid into the booth opposite her, the vinyl groaning under his weight. He did not take off his coat. He simply sat, his hands resting on the table, palms down. They were large, clean hands with a heavy gold ring on his right pinky finger, the kind of ring that looked like it had history. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. She had invited a storm to her table, and she had no idea what to do now that it was here. She was Ava, a nurse just off a 16-hour holiday shift, in faded blue scrubs that smelled faintly of antiseptic. He was something else entirely. Something dangerous. She could feel it like a change in barometric pressure. "Long night?" he asked, his gaze fixed on her, intense and assessing. "The longest," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "You?" A muscle worked in his jaw. "They're all long." The waitress appeared, her pen poised over her notepad, her eyes wide as she took in Ava's guest. "Can I get you something, sir?" "Coffee. Black," he ordered, his eyes never leaving Ava's. The waitress scurried away. "I'm Ava," she offered, trying to fill the silence. It felt like a foolish, naive thing to do, like offering her name to a wolf. "Dante," he returned. Just the one name. It landed between them with the finality of a closing door. She watched him, trying to piece together the puzzle he presented. His suit, visible where his coat fell open, was exquisitely tailored, the dark gray wool whispering of money and power. Yet he was here, in a 24-hour diner in a forgotten part of the city on New Year's Eve. It made no sense. He looked like a man who commanded private rooms in restaurants that didn't have names on the door. He caught her staring. A flicker of something, amusement, or maybe irritation, crossed his features before vanishing. "You work at St. Jude's," he stated. It was not a question. Ava's blood ran cold. She instinctively touched the embroidered logo on her scrubs. "How did you know that?" "I notice things," he said simply, as if that explained everything. It explained nothing at all. Before she could press him, the diner's bell chimed again. This time, the cold that entered the room had nothing to do with the weather. 3 men stepped inside, their shoulders broad, their expressions hard. They moved with a synchronized purpose that was immediately menacing. They were not here for coffee. They scanned the room, their eyes landing on Dante. A slow, predatory smile spread across the leader's face. Dante did not turn. He did not even tense. He simply watched Ava, but his eyes had gone flat and cold, like frozen lakes. The warmth of the diner evaporated. The cheerful noise faded into a dull, threatening hum. Ava's training kicked in, her mind automatically assessing the threat, the exits, the potential for harm. She saw the bulge under the leader's jacket. She saw the way the other two fanned out, cutting off the path to the kitchen and the main door. "You made a mistake coming here tonight, Moretti," the leader said, his voice loud enough to carry. The few patrons who noticed began to shrink into their seats. The waitress froze behind the counter. Dante's focus remained entirely on Ava. "Finish your coffee," he said, his voice impossibly calm. "We're leaving." Ava's heart hammered against her ribs. She had thought she was being kind to a lonely man. But she had not invited a man to her table. She had invited a target. And by sitting with him, she had just painted one on her own back. The world she knew, of sterile hallways and beeping machines, of life and death measured in steady drips, had just collided with another world. A world of men with cold eyes and unseen weapons, where names were spoken like threats. Her simple act of kindness was about to cost her everything. He was right. They were leaving. But she had a sickening feeling she would not be going home. The air in the diner grew thick, charged with the metallic tang of imminent violence. The leader of the three men, a bull of a man with a scarred eyebrow, took a step closer to their booth. His men flanked him, their movements fluid and practiced. They were a pack, and they had cornered their prey. Or so they thought. Dante still had not moved. He hadn't so much as glanced in their direction. His attention was a physical weight on Ava, pinning her in place. "Ava," he said, his voice a low command. "Put your hands on the table where I can see them." Her mind screamed at her to run, to dive under the table, to do anything but obey. But his certainty was absolute. It was the calm at the center of a hurricane. Trembling, she placed her hands flat on the worn formica surface. His eyes flickered down to them, then back to her face. A silent approval. "You see, Falcone," Dante said, his voice carrying easily through the tense room, though he hadn't raised it. "You have terrible timing. I was having a conversation." The man named Falcone laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Your conversation is over. So are you," he gestured with his chin to Ava. "And you picked a poor choice for a last meal. Hospital scrubs. How pathetic." A change occurred in Dante's stillness. It was almost imperceptible, a tightening of the muscles around his eyes, a subtle shift in his posture that coiled his entire body like a spring. Before Falcone could take another step, Dante moved. It was not a flurry of motion. It was a single, brutally efficient act. He picked up the heavy ceramic sugar dispenser from the table. In the same fluid movement, he was out of the booth, not away from Falcone, but toward him. He brought the dispenser down on the side of Falcone's head with a sickening crack. The man crumpled without a sound. The other two men reacted a split second too late. One reached inside his jacket, but Dante was already on him. He drove his elbow into the man's throat, slamming him back against the diner's counter. Coffee mugs rattled and fell, shattering on the floor. The second man pulled his weapon, a short-barreled revolver. Ava screamed, a sound swallowed by the chaos. But Dante used the first man as a shield, spinning him around just as the gun went off. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space. The man in Dante's grip grunted, his body absorbing the bullet meant for Dante. Dante shoved the dying man into the gunman and closed the distance. He moved with a terrifying grace, a choreographer of violence. He disarmed the man with a sharp twist of the wrist, the gun clattering to the linoleum floor. Two quick, precise strikes followed, one to the throat, one to the temple. The second man collapsed, joining his leader in unconsciousness on the floor. It was over in less than 10 seconds. The diner was plunged into a shocked, ringing silence, broken only by the whimpering of a customer in a nearby booth and the frantic, unheard whispers of the hostess on the phone, presumably calling the police. Dante stood over the three fallen men, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. He was not even breathing hard. He looked down at his hands, then wiped the one that held the sugar dispenser on a napkin from the counter. He turned, his dark eyes finding Ava where she sat, frozen in the booth. The cold calculation in his gaze was more frightening than the violence she had just witnessed. "I told you," he said, his voice level. "We're leaving." He reached her in 2 strides, grabbing her arm. His grip was not rough, but it was unbreakable. It was the grip of a man who was accustomed to people doing exactly as he said. He pulled her from the booth, his body shielding hers from the scene on the floor. "My bag," she stammered, her eyes darting to her worn purse on the seat. "Leave it," he commanded, pulling her toward the back of the diner. "There's an exit through the kitchen." Sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer with each passing second. Panic finally broke through Ava's shock. "The police are coming. We should wait. We need to tell them what happened." Dante stopped and turned to her, his face inches from hers. The scent of cedar and gunpowder was sharp in her nostrils. "The police are the last people I want to talk to. And as of 30 seconds ago, they're the last people you want to talk to either. You are now a material witness to 3 assaults. You sat with me. You are involved. Do you understand?" She understood all too well. She had seen the gun. She had been sitting at his table. In the eyes of the law, she was an accomplice, or, at the very least, a person of interest. Her life, her career, her quiet anonymity, all of it was gone. He had not just saved her from Falcone's men. He had implicated her in his world. He saw the understanding dawn on her face. A flicker of something that might have been regret crossed his features, but it was gone as quickly as it came. "Good," he said. He pushed open the swinging door to the kitchen and pulled her through. The kitchen staff were huddled against the far wall, their faces pale with terror. Dante ignored them, his eyes fixed on the steel door at the back. He kicked it open, and the freezing night air hit them like a slap in the face. The sirens were deafening now, just a block or 2 away. He dragged her into the narrow, snow-filled alley behind the diner. A sleek black car, so out of place in this grimy setting, was waiting at the end of the alley, its engine already humming. The back door opened as they approached. "Get in," Dante ordered. Ava hesitated for a fraction of a second, her feet planted in the dirty snow. This was the moment, the point of no return. She could scream, run, fight. But she looked back at the diner, at the flashing red and blue lights painting the street, and then at the man beside her. His face was carved from stone, impassive and unyielding. Running from him seemed infinitely more dangerous than whatever lay ahead. With a feeling of cold dread, she slid into the car's plush leather interior. Dante got in behind her, shutting the door with a solid, final thud that sealed her in. The car pulled away from the curb smoothly, disappearing into the snowy city streets just as the first police cruiser screamed into the alley. She was no longer just Ava, the nurse. She was a woman who had left a diner with Dante Moretti. And she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that her old life had just ended. The car moved through the city with an unnerving smoothness, the chaos of the diner fading into a distant, dreamlike memory. Ava stared out the tinted window at the blur of holiday lights and falling snow, her reflection a ghostly image superimposed over the city. She felt disconnected, as if she were watching a movie of someone else's life. Beside her, Dante was on the phone, his voice a low, clipped murmur. He used no names, only pronouns. "It's handled. Yes, all 3. There was a complication. I have her with me now. Find out everything." He snapped the phone shut and dropped it onto the seat between them. The silence that followed was heavier than before. Ava wrapped her arms around herself, the thin fabric of her scrubs offering little comfort against the chill that had settled deep in her bones. "Where are you taking me?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "Somewhere safe," he replied without looking at her. "Safe for whom?" She shot back, a spark of anger cutting through her fear. "For you? Or for me?" That got his attention. He turned his head slowly, his dark eyes boring into hers. "For now, they are the same thing." He let that sink in before continuing. "The men in the diner were from the Falcone family. They are rivals. By sitting with me, you became a person of interest to them. By leaving with me, you became my liability. I don't like liabilities. I was just trying to be nice, she said, the words sounding hollow and naive even to her own ears. You looked alone. A humorless smile touched his lips. Lesson number 1, he said, his voice soft, almost gentle, which was somehow more menacing. In my world, no one is ever just nice, and loneliness is a weapon people use against you. You handed them a weapon tonight. The car turned off the main thoroughfare, heading toward a part of the city she didn't recognize, all warehouses and dark, empty lots. It finally pulled into a private underground garage and stopped in a dimly lit space. A man in a dark suit, his face impassive, was waiting for them. He opened Dante's door. Is the place secure?
Dante asked him.
Yes, boss. No one followed. It's clean.
Boss.
The word confirmed everything Ava had already suspected. This was not just a man with enemies. This was a man in charge. He led her from the garage into a service elevator, which rose silently for several floors before opening directly into a large, sparsely furnished apartment. It was clean, modern, and utterly devoid of personality. It felt less like a home and more like a holding cell with a better view. Floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over the industrial landscape. The distant city lights a cold comfort. You'll stay here tonight, Dante said, shrugging off his heavy coat and tossing it onto a minimalist leather sofa. Underneath, he wore a perfectly fitted black shirt that did nothing to hide the lean, powerful muscles of his chest and arms. Don't touch the windows. Don't try to use the phone. Someone will bring you some clothes and food. He turned to leave, but Ava found her voice. And you? What happens to you? He paused at the door, his back to her. I have to clean up the mess you made. The accusation stung, but she knew he was right. Her simple, impulsive act of kindness had set off a chain reaction, and she had no idea how far the consequences would ripple. He left, the heavy door locking behind him with an audible click. Ava was alone, a prisoner in a gilded cage. She walked to the center of the vast living room, feeling small and exposed. She finally allowed herself to tremble, the adrenaline of the past hour draining away, leaving her exhausted and terrified. Hours passed. A silent woman with a pinched face brought a tray of food and a set of plain gray sweats, leaving without a word. Ava picked at the food, her appetite gone. She changed out of her scrubs, folding them carefully as if they were a relic from a past life. She tried to sleep on the sofa, but every creak of the building, every distant siren, had her sitting bolt upright, her heart pounding. It was nearly dawn when the door opened again. Dante returned, looking weary. There was a dark bruise forming high on his cheekbone she hadn't noticed before, and a fresh cut on his knuckles. He moved to a cabinet and poured himself a measure of amber liquid into a glass, downing it in one swallow. He saw her watching him. Falcone is alive, he said, answering her unasked question. His men are not. The situation has been contained. Contained. It was such a sterile word for what she knew it meant. She looked at the cut on his hand. Without thinking, she got up and went to the small kitchen area, searching the cabinets until she found a first aid kit. It was a nurse's instinct, a need to fix what was broken. She brought it back to him, opening it on the low table in front of the sofa. Let me see your hand, she said quietly. He looked from the kit to her face, his expression unreadable. He seemed surprised. After a long moment, he sat down and extended his hand. She took it gently. His skin was warm, his hand steady in hers. As she carefully cleaned the abrasion with an antiseptic wipe, her fingers brushed against a faded white scar that circled his wrist, partially hidden by his expensive watch. It was old, perfectly healed, but clearly once a serious injury. He saw where she was looking. His hand tensed slightly in hers. An old argument, he said, his voice flat. She didn't press. She just continued her work, her touch gentle and professional. She wrapped a small bandage around the new cut. Her fingers lingered on his for a moment longer than necessary. The silence in the room was different now. It was not empty. It was filled with a strange, unspoken tension. He was watching her, his gaze so intense it felt like a physical touch. "You're not afraid of me," he said. It was the same thing he'd said in the diner, but this time it sounded different. Less like an observation, more like a question he couldn't answer himself. "I'm a nurse," she replied, her voice low. "I've seen worse things than a fist fight." She met his gaze, holding it. "And I've seen men bleed for much stupider reasons." He didn't pull his hand away. He just watched her, and in his dark eyes, she saw a flicker of something she had not seen before. Not coldness, not anger, but a deep, profound loneliness that echoed her own. It was the reason she had waved at him in the first place. And she realized with a sinking heart that she had been right about him all along. He was a monster, yes, a killer, but he was also just a man, alone in a room at the dawn of a new year. And that, she was beginning to fear, was far more dangerous. A tense and fragile truce settled between them in the sterile safe house. For 2 days, they coexisted in silence. Dante was a phantom, coming and going at odd hours, his face a mask of grim preoccupation. Ava was a ghost, haunting the edges of the apartment, her world shrunk to 4 walls and a view of a frozen river. A guard was always posted outside the door, a constant, silent reminder of her gilded captivity. On the 3rd day, an opportunity presented itself. Dante was gone, and the guard who brought her breakfast was new, younger, and less disciplined than the others. He left the door unlocked for a fraction of a second too long when he turned to answer his phone. It was a sliver of a chance, a breath of possibility. Her heart leaped into her throat. This was it. She could run. She could disappear back into the city, find a way to reclaim her stolen life. She moved to the door, her hand hovering over the handle. She peeked through the peephole. The young guard was distracted, his back to her. Beyond him, down the hall, was the elevator. Freedom. But then she saw them. 2 men, loitering near the stairwell at the far end of the corridor. They were trying to look casual, but their stillness was all wrong. They were watching the apartment.
They were not Dante's men.
Their coats were cheaper, their posture more aggressive. Falcone's men. Cold dread washed over her. Running was not an escape. It was a death sentence. They were not waiting for Dante. They were waiting for her. She was the loose end, the liability he'd spoken of. She slowly backed away from the door, her chance for freedom dissolving into the chilling realization that the most dangerous man she knew was also the only one keeping her alive. She retreated to the living room, her mind racing. She was trapped between 2 warring factions, a pawn in a game she didn't understand. Later that afternoon, Dante returned. He looked exhausted, the lines around his eyes deeper than before. He threw a file folder onto the coffee table. It landed with a heavy slap. "Look at it," he commanded. Her hands trembled as she reached for it. She opened it to find pages of surveillance photos, financial records, and detailed notes. The subject of the file was the company that held the primary supply contract for St. Jude's Hospital. Her hospital. And, at the bottom of the last page, a handwritten note. Falcone front. Laundered funds. It all clicked into place with sickening clarity. He had not been in that diner by chance. He had not been there because he was lonely. He had been there for work, surveilling the area, gathering intelligence on his enemy. Her hospital was a cog in their criminal machine. Her wave, her offer of a seat, had not been an act of kindness. It had been an interruption, an unforeseen complication in a war she hadn't known existed. "You are watching my hospital," she whispered, the words tasting like ash. "You were never alone. It was all a lie." "It was a job," he corrected, his voice devoid of emotion. "You were a coincidence." The revelation should have made her hate him. It should have severed the fragile, unspoken connection that had begun to form between them. But all she felt was a profound sense of despair. He was not the lonely man she'd projected her own feelings onto. He was something far more complex and dangerous. And she was tangled in the web he was weaving. That night the attack came. It began not with a bang, but with the sudden, unnerving silence of the power being cut. The apartment was plunged into darkness, the emergency lights casting long, eerie shadows. Dante was on his feet in an instant, a gun appearing in his hand as if from nowhere. "They're here," he said, his voice a low growl. "They cut the lines. They'll be coming up the stairs." He grabbed her arm, pulling her away from the windows. "Stay behind me." Sounds of a struggle erupted from the hallway, followed by a muffled gunshot. The guard was down. Heavy footsteps pounded toward their door. There was no escape. They were on the 20th floor. The elevator was dead. The stairwell was compromised. "There's a service hatch in the kitchen pantry," Dante said, his mind working with cold, tactical precision. "It leads to a maintenance crawlspace between the floors. It's our only way out." He pulled her into the small pantry. As he worked the latches on the ceiling hatch, the apartment door splintered, heavy blows raining down on it. They were running out of time. He boosted her up into the dark, dusty space, then climbed in after her, pulling the hatch closed just as the main door to the apartment burst open. They lay flat in the cramped, dark space, dust motes dancing in the thin beam of the flashlight from Dante's phone. Below them, they could hear the heavy boots and angry shouts of Falcone's men as they tore the apartment apart, looking for them. "They'll find the hatch," Ava whispered, her voice shaking. "I know," Dante breathed, his face grim in the pale light. "We have to move." They crawled through the suffocating darkness, the sounds of their pursuers echoing below. The crawlspace ran the length of the building, but it was a maze of pipes and wiring. At one point, they came to a junction. A large pipe, slick with condensation, blocked their path. Dante shone the light on it. A yellow warning label was stenciled on the side, "Natural gas main." An idea, desperate and terrible, sparked in Ava's mind. It was a fragment of knowledge from a toxicology lecture in nursing school, a memory of chemical reactions. "The gas," she said, her voice urgent. "If we can create a leak and a spark, a small one, at the other end of the building." Dante looked at her, his eyes narrowing in the darkness. He understood immediately. A diversion, an explosion to draw them away, to make them think they were trying to escape from the far side of the building. It was a reckless, dangerous plan, but it was their only chance. "How?" he asked. She told him. A specific valve to weaken, a wire from a nearby junction box to create the spark. It was a morally gray, terrifying calculus of risk and violence. This was not healing. This was destruction. She was actively helping him, not as a victim, but as a partner. She had crossed a line she could never uncross. He listened intently, then gave a single, sharp nod. He moved away, disappearing into the darkness to set the trap. Ava waited, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She was no longer just a witness. She was an accessory, an accomplice. And as she waited in the dark for the explosion she had designed, she knew she was lost. The muffled boom from the far end of the building was followed by the shriek of a fire alarm. Below them, the shouts of Falcone's men changed from searching to panicked. They were moving away, drawn toward the diversion. It had worked. Dante reappeared from the darkness, his face smudged with grease. He grabbed her hand. "Now," he said, and pulled her through the crawlspace toward the opposite end of the building, away from the chaos they had created. They emerged into another service corridor, then down a series of back stairwells until they reached the deserted loading dock. The cold night air was a shock to the system. Another black car was waiting, this one different from the first. They sped away into the night, leaving the sirens and the fire behind. Neither of them spoke. The adrenaline of the escape slowly drained away, leaving a heavy, charged silence in its wake. This time, the car did not take them to another anonymous safe house. It climbed the winding roads into the hills overlooking the city, stopping before a set of imposing iron gates that opened silently for them. They drove up a long, tree-lined driveway to a sprawling modern fortress of glass and stone, a stark contrast to the sterile apartment. This was his home, his throne. Inside, the house was a testament to quiet, immense wealth. It was all clean lines, dark wood, and priceless art, yet it felt as cold and empty as the safe house. He led her to a vast living room with a wall of glass that offered a panoramic view of the glittering city below. He poured them both a drink, his hands steady. He handed her a glass, his fingers brushing hers. The contact sent a jolt through her. He stood before the window, looking out at the city. He clearly ruled. "You should have run," he said, his voice quiet. Back at the apartment, when the guard was distracted, "You had a chance." Ava clutched her glass, the cold seeping into her skin. "I know," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. She did not look at him. She looked at her own pale reflection in the dark glass. He moved to stand beside her, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. "Why didn't you?" She finally turned to meet his gaze. His eyes were dark, searching, stripped of all their usual defenses. She gave him the only truth she had left. "Because you were the only one in that diner who looked as alone as I felt." A muscle tightened in his jaw. He reached out, his hand coming to rest on the side of her face, his thumb stroking her jawline. The touch was gentle, yet possessive. It was a brand. "Loneliness is a luxury I can't afford," he said, his voice a low, rough murmur. "And now neither can you." It was not a declaration of love. It was a confession of a shared sentence. He was not offering her a future. He was telling her she was now part of his prison. And in that moment, staring into the abyss of his eyes, she did not feel fear. She felt a terrifying, undeniable sense of coming home. The next morning, Dante was gone when she woke up on a couch in his cavernous living room. A different silent woman had left clothes for her, simple, elegant pieces in black and gray that fit perfectly. They felt like a costume for a role she had not auditioned for. Ava spent the day exploring the house, a restless phantom in a place that was both a fortress and a cage. She found a library filled with books on history and strategy, a gym with state-of-the-art equipment, and a kitchen that a master chef would envy. But there were no photographs, no personal mementos. It was the home of a man who did not allow himself a past. He returned late that night, a storm cloud of controlled fury entering the house with him. He did not speak to her, but stalked to his office and shut the door. The low, angry murmur of his voice on the phone carried through the thick wood. Ava knew this could not continue. This limbo. This waiting for the other shoe to drop. The Falcones would not stop looking for her. She was a threat, a witness. Dante could not hide her forever. He had to end it. She made a decision. She would not be a liability. She would be an asset. She walked to his office and, without knocking, opened the door. He was standing by the window, phone pressed to his ear, his back to her. He turned, his eyes flashing with anger at the intrusion. He held up a hand, telling her to wait, but she ignored it. She walked to his desk and picked up a pen. On a blank sheet of paper, she began to draw a schematic of the ground floor of St. Jude's Hospital. She marked the loading bays, the supply closets, the exact routes the Falcone-owned company used to deliver their goods, and where their drivers took their breaks. It was information only a long-term employee would know. The small, exploitable details. He ended his call abruptly, his eyes fixed on what she was doing. He came to stand behind her, watching as she pointed to a specific point on her crude map. "Their main delivery comes on Wednesdays, between 2 and 4 in the morning. They use the east loading bay because Camera 7 has a blind spot. The driver, a man named Sal, always leaves the truck unattended for at least 10 minutes to go to the vending machine on the sublevel." She looked up at him, her gaze unflinching. "That truck is their bank. It's how they move their cash. You don't need a war. You just need to take out their garbage." The look on his face was one of stunned appraisal. He was seeing her for the first time, not as a complication or a victim, but as a strategist. A weapon. He slowly reached out and took the pen from her hand, his fingers closing over hers. "You are full of surprises, Ava." He planned the strike for the following Wednesday. He tried to leave her at the house, to keep her safe and far from the violence. She refused. "I started this," she said, her voice firm. "I'm not going to hide while you finish it. I'm your best source of information. You need me there." It was a battle of wills, but he finally relented, seeing the unshakable resolve in her eyes. The plan was simple, surgical. His men would intercept the truck, remove the money, and leave a message. No bloodshed, just a crippling financial blow that would break the Falcone family's power in the city. The night of the operation was cold and clear. They sat in a car a block away from the hospital, watching. Everything happened exactly as Ava had predicted.
The truck arrived.
The driver, Sal, got out and headed into the hospital. Dante's men moved in, silent and efficient shadows in the dark. It was going perfectly. But then, a second car screeched to a halt behind the truck. The elder Falcone himself got out, flanked by two of his most trusted men. It was a surprise inspection. A trap. A firefight erupted in the loading bay. Dante cursed, shoving a small, heavy pistol into Ava's hands. "Stay here. Do not get out of this car." He was out the door before she could protest, joining the fray. Ava watched in horror as the quiet operation devolved into a chaotic gun battle. She couldn't just sit there. She was a nurse. Her instinct was to help, to save. But the gun in her hand was cold and alien. Then she saw it. Falcone had circled around the fighting and was coming up behind Dante, using the truck as cover. He was going to execute him. Without thinking, Ava was out of the car. She wasn't a fighter. She couldn't shoot, but she had something else. In her pocket, she still carried a small medical kit, a habit from her job. Inside was a syringe of lorazepam, a powerful sedative used for agitated patients. She filled the syringe as she ran, her movements deft and practiced. She rounded the front of the truck just as Falcone raised his weapon. "More Eddie!" she screamed. Dante turned, his eyes widening as he saw her, then Falcone. But it was too late for him to react. Falcone swung his gun toward her, a snarl on his face. She didn't hesitate. She lunged forward and plunged the syringe deep into his thigh, depressing the plunger. He roared in pain and surprise, swatting her away like a fly. She hit the ground hard. The air knocked from her lungs. The sedative wouldn't take him down instantly, but it would be fast. It bought the one thing Dante needed: a second. In that single, drug-induced moment of disorientation for Falcone, Dante fired twice. The shots were precise, final. The Falcone leader crumpled to the ground. The fight was over. Dante was at her side in an instant, helping her up, his hands checking her for injuries. His face was a mask of raw, violent terror. "I told you to stay in the car," he growled, his voice shaking with fury and relief. "You're welcome," she choked out, her body aching. He stared at her, at the empty syringe still clutched in her hand, at the fierce, untamed look in her eyes. The last of his control seemed to snap. He pulled her against him, his arms crushing her in an embrace that was less about comfort and more about possession. He buried his face in her hair, breathing her in. "What you did tonight," he began, his voice rough against her ear. "You belong in this world." It sounded like a damnation. She pulled back just enough to look him in the eye, her hands framing his face. "No," she said, her voice clear and certain amidst the carnage. "I belong with you. There's a difference." The cost of that night was absolute. Her old life was not just gone. It was a ghost. She could never go back to St. Jude's, never again be just Ava the nurse. She was now the woman who had stood with Dante Moretti, the woman who had helped bring down his enemies. She had paid for her seat at his table with her entire world. They stood in his penthouse, the first light of a new day breaking over the city. The snow had stopped. The world outside was clean and white and silent. He handed her a glass of whiskey, the same way he had after the first night. She did not look at the view. She looked at his hand as he held the glass, the faint white scar on his wrist a permanent reminder of a past he never spoke of, the newly healed cut on his knuckle a testament to the future she had chosen. He followed her gaze. He set his own glass down and covered her hand with his thumb tracing the back of her knuckles. He did not say he loved her. He did not say he would protect her. He did not have to. The silence between them was the promise. It was the cage. It was, against all odds, home.